minds. Ellen White describes in that book how our mind was meant to be able to grow. But the way that it grows is by contemplating large and deep, profound ideas, thinking about eternity, thinking about the love of God, considering the idea of our destiny and the breadth of our duty. These are all very large ideas. We can't really comprehend them, but we can think about them. And in the process of thinking about them, our minds become stronger. The opposite is also true. When we don't think about things larger than we can easily grasp, our minds become weaker. Very much like an arm that's in a cast or a body that's forced to lie for weeks in a bed. Have any of you ever had that kind of experience with the arm in the cast or the body in the bed? The strength was there, but as it wasn't used, it's lost. And many of us have lost the strength of our mind. We've lost the strength of our mind in this respect because we haven't thought about those large ideas, haven't spent the proper time contemplating them. Our minds have narrowed down so they're only capable of dealing with little commonplace human, the kind of stuff that happens all around us. You want to read that chapter in the book Education, the chapters that are there. We haven't read anything yet here in Job 38. Look at verse 2. Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Job 38:2 is such an interesting question because it looks like it's being given in reference to Job's three friends. And when I read, or four of them really are involved in the book of Job, when I read what they have to say, these men had a great deal of what I would call knowledge. In fact, if you're not careful, I challenge you to try this for about 10 years. Whenever you see a quotation from the book of Job, look it up in your Bible and see who's speaking. And I think you'll find that about 1/4 of the quotations from the book of Job are being quoted from these friends who darkened counsel by words without knowledge. Did that make any sense to you, what I just said? But what they say has enough idea or thought in it that it looks sensible. You can almost make proverbs out of some of these things. But what did God say in Job 38 about their words? Those were words without knowledge. Those words darkened counsel. Let me jump into my first point, and then we'll get to our list and move through it very rapidly today. Have you ever heard this idea that we're to teach the young people how to be thinkers and not merely reflectors of men's thoughts? And the way we usually shorten that is we say we want to teach them how to think for themselves. And the way we tend to say it when we're young is, I want to learn to think for myself. And when we take this whole idea of thinking for ourselves, the trick of the devil in this is to put the emphasis on myself and not on think. And I just want to portray this idea as I'm understanding it. There is a difference between thinking for myself and concluding for myself. There is a difference between thinking and opining. But we don't use the word opining, so I should explain what I mean. Thinking and making my own opinion. The devil would like to so confound those ideas that when you come to your own conclusion, you figure that you're thinking for yourself. But thinking and concluding are so far from being the same thing. They're the difference between working through the problem and writing down an answer. Can you see it in your algebra class, how it would go if you decided that you were just going to write down whatever answer you thought would be kind of pretty at the end of the equal sign? That would not be thinking. I've said that 4 times. I should move on. So trick number 1 that we're going over today is the trick. The devil has told many young people that they will not enjoy heaven. They won't like heaven. Heaven will be boring. That trick is rarely used on people over the age of 18. I think it's more often used right around the ages of 11 and 12. Because when you get a little older, you can see right through it usually, right? You can just you realize that the same God who gave me taste buds so that I can enjoy good apples, the same God who gave me an ability to enjoy being able to move quickly, the same God who gave me an ability to enjoy love and affection, He's the one who invented heaven. And the idea that I am going to have less capacity to enjoy, like, can you see how inconsistent this is? To think that in heaven I'm going to have more capacity to grow, more capacity to think, a bigger body, a stronger mind, more capacity to live, like I'll never die, and then to think I'm going to have less capacity to enjoy. It isn't sensible at all. And our first point here is for the very young, because you'd be surprised at how consistently the devil does tell young people that they're not going to enjoy heaven, because they associate heaven with the restriction of the things they like to do for fun. Maybe we can come back to that in an afternoon session for a minute or two of development. The answer to that is in Proverbs 16. Why don't you turn there with me for a minute? Proverbs 16. No, it's not Proverbs, it's Psalms. Psalm 16, and looking at verse 11. Psalm 16 and verse 11. It says, "Thou wilt show me the path of life. In thy presence is fullness of joy." Listen carefully. "At thy right hand there are," what's the word? Pleasures for evermore. And so we talked about last night, how rebellion, at least originally, sprang up through the dissemination of lies. Lies lead to rebellion. That is, when people don't really understand what God thinks and does and how He is, they're not nearly as inclined to submit to Him. And you see now why the devil would like to tell very young people that they won't enjoy heaven? It's because of the beautiful truth that if they knew how much they would enjoy heaven, they surely wouldn't let anything keep them from getting there. Turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 12. We're on to our second point already today. Matthew chapter 12, looking at verse 38. The second trick of the devil we're talking about this morning is what I call the prove it trick. The first trick was, I won't like heaven. The second trick is prove it, as people say. Matthew 12 and verse 38. "Then certain of the scribes and of the Pharisees answered, saying, Master, we would see a sign from thee." So why did they ask for proof? You know, it's because they didn't want to believe. And before I expose this trick for the trick that it is, I'd just like us to be able to self-identify the cause of how it works so well. It's when we don't want to believe that we tend to demand proof. If someone came with evidence that eating apple pie was good for us, we would likely accept it without any checking of references. All right? When is it that we tend to demand proof? It's when we don't like the conclusion. My father died of lung cancer 8 years ago. And dying of lung cancer, at least for my father, was a slow, painful, and very hard to watch process. Do you know, in the 19th century, in the 1800s, there were many people that suspected that smoking was bad for your health. But there wasn't any proof in the 1800s. What there was is evidence. There were people who observed that smokers tend to cough more than others. and that coughing people tend to get sick more than others, and that people that tend to cough a lot and get sick a lot, if it becomes a continual, habitual thing, they often die of tumors. People did observe things like that even in the 1800s, and there were people who said that smoking is bad for your health. At the same time, there were others that observed that people who cough, many times smoking will help calm down their coughing. And there was some legitimacy to this. And there were a number of people who made presentations to the effect that smoking might be good for you, at least for some ailments in some circumstances. Now, let me just jump to my point, because it isn't about smoking at all. It's that sometimes it's very dangerous to wait until proof is available. I mean that smoking would kill someone in 1820 the same way it killed my dad in 2001. My dad had a whole lot more evidence than the man who would die in 1820, but the cigarettes hurt them just the same. Do you follow what I'm saying? I think this is a real parallel, for example, to the state right now of science in relation to the effects of music. I think that if you go really searching diligently, you can find significant evidence that the kinds of music that are unrecommended by parents in this kind of church, you can find real evidence that that kind of music is bad for us morally. But if I'd be very frank with even the parents, I don't think what you can find would qualify as proof. I don't think that when I've taken the evidence myself and tried to compile it, that I can find stuff on both sides, and I think that someone looking at it, a young person who is being very sincere, could say that if you're being just really hard on the data like you need to be in research, you can tear a lot of this apart, and what you're left with is it's evidence, but it doesn't qualify for proof. And let me just bring this to the conclusion. If when I go to the Spokane airport on Monday morning, if when I walk in an alarm goes off and an announcer says, "Please calmly exit the building, there has been a bomb threat," even though I know from my experience with the news that probably there's less than a 1 in 50 chance that there really is a bomb there. Do you know what I'm talking about? Very few bomb threats are connected to real bombs. Still, I'm going to very politely and happily exit the building. Right? It's because the amount of risk I'm willing to take is related to the value of the object that is at risk. And if I was risking losing $1, I wouldn't care really about $1. I really wouldn't care about the bomb threat. But what I'm risking is losing a life. And in view of the great treasure I could lose, even a very small risk is sufficient to lead me to exercise extreme caution. My caution ought to be sensibly proportionate to the risk. Do you follow what I'm saying about this? This is why we should not demand proof. In many cases, we need to go with the bulk of evidence. We need to run, especially if what's at stake is something as great a treasure as my soul, if there really is a significant chance that this activity could harm me in a spiritual sense. I'm not going to tell you that I'm sure that it will. I don't have to preach to you that I'm 100% certain that it will, to, in a very sensible way, say, I'm not going to partake. Does that make any sense to you what I'm saying? I can refuse to go there simply on the treasure that I don't want to risk for something that isn't certain if I see significant evidence pointing in that direction. Yeah. So I've talked a little bit about that trick of demanding proof. I think just remember how we started this trick, that many times when do we demand proof? It's when we really don't want to believe, and we just shouldn't let ourselves deceive ourselves that way. Our third trick that I'm talking about this morning, I'll call it the I'm rich and doing evangelism trick. Turn with me in your Bibles to Ezekiel 33. Ezekiel 33 is a fascinating passage. It's helpful in sharing the truth that once you're saved, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be faithful to the end. And we want to observe a thought here. Ezekiel 13 and looking at 33 and looking at verse 13. Ezekiel 33 and verse 13. When I shall say to the righteous that he shall surely live. If we stop there, I want you to see that this righteous man must be a justified man. He can't be a self-righteous man because that's not the kind of man that Jesus ever says to him, thou shalt surely live. The first half of this verse is about someone who's had a real experience of trusting God. But look at what happens. When I say to the righteous that he shall surely live, if he, what's it say? Trust to his own righteousness and commit iniquity, all his righteousnesses shall not be remembered. The trick that's described here that the devil uses, if he can't stop you from being justified, if he can't keep you from coming to the point of full surrender, then after the point of full surrender, he'll try to get you to compare yourselves to the majority. Because the truth is the majority isn't fully surrendered. They never have been, even in church. And it's such a silly trick that we fall for it. I mean, to look around us and let the devil tell us that since we finally, here we were battling with this temptation and that one, this one and that one, finally we've given up those things that we were rebelling on for so long, and now we're suddenly a head above. Isn't it true that we're just a head above the people who are just like we were just a few days ago? But the devil would like us at this point to compare ourselves. And if we would begin comparing ourselves with others, we can often fall for the trick described in this verse of beginning to think that if anyone's going to get to heaven, it must be me, since I'm one of the few I know who's even at this level. And that's just a nasty trick that gives Jesus the glory and then takes it right back. That trust him and then trust self. And we shouldn't fall for it. The rich and increase with goods and in need of nothing. Trick. The fourth trick we're talking about is so related in character but not in thought. Look at Luke chapter 18. I needed helpers for this. Now I know some... Is Miss Sarah Page in the audience here? Or is she not? Miss Sarah, could you come up here for a minute? You won't have to say anything. You won't have to say a single word. And then is Miss Heather Ruiz also here? Is Heather here? Heather, could you come up here for just a minute? I did write down both your names on my notes. I didn't just make this up. I had them here. Heather, could you I need to move a chair for a minute to make this work, right? Heather, could you stand right about here? Yeah, right about there. Did I say Heather? I looked at Sarah and said Heather, but Heather, go ahead. And then Sarah, let me move this chair, and then you're going to stand right in front of it. I'd like you to stand right about there. Now, ladies, you don't have to say anything. You're just illustrating something. Oh, this will work better if I do it a little different. Heather, I'd like you to stand right there. Okay. What you need to do, Heather, is I want you to try to stay in between Sarah and I, about equal distance between us. So she's not going to move, I'm going to move, and so you'll just have to watch where I am to stay equally between us. Do you understand what you're going to try to do? Okay, here we go. Okay, that's all. You all can go back to your seats now. You served my purpose, all right? Thank you. Can I tell you what I was trying to illustrate by that silly activity? It's a very common trick of the devil. Have you heard this idea that the liberals are like the Sadducees and the conservatives are like the Pharisees? Have you ever heard anyone try to make an analogy like that? The devil would like to change the way we find truth from looking at the data to looking at the populace. And the devil would like to lead us to conclude, to get us to choose the way we live on the basis of avoiding extremes. So in a way, I almost talk to myself like this. I am not an extremist. I am not an extremist. And the way we try to stay in the middle of the road is by making sure that we don't go to either extreme. Can you follow what I'm communicating right now, the idea? It becomes a balancing act. The way we choose our life becomes a balancing act. But can you just see, just by illustration, that a balancing act is not a stable way of determining your positions? Because all the devil has to manipulate, all he has to do to manipulate me, if he wants me to move to the right, all he has to do is bring some right extremist and put them out there in my field of vision. And then I'll feel a little bit left of center. Or if he wants to move me to the left, he can bring some left extremist or a bunch more people on the left. And as they're way out there, I'll feel a little bit right of center. And it really becomes very easy to just move me around. People who choose their values like this, moving from one part of the country to another, is often a shock to their value system. Because you follow the idea. You're in Luke 18, aren't you? Look at verse 11. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself. God, I thank thee that I am not, what's it say? As other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. Can you see the irony in this idea? For a man to say that, Father, I thank thee that I am not like the Sadducee, and I'm not like this Pharisee, and in saying it, to be just like the Pharisee in the parable. What did the Pharisee in the parable do? He evaluated the correctness of his own position and experience, his religious experience, on the basis of distancing himself from those that he knew to be wrong in their experience. And we can't do it. It's just a trick. I've said it so many ways, I don't know how to make it more clear. I'm moving on. Our fifth trick we're talking about, I call it the authorities disagree trick. Do you remember that? It talks about this in the Bible. In fact, let's look at one of the places. Look at John chapter 9. John chapter 9. And we're looking at verse 16. John 9 and verse 16. Therefore said some of the Pharisees, this man is not of God. That would be Jesus. Because he keeps not the Sabbath day. Others said, how can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? And there was, what's it say? Can I explain to you how this trick worked with the people in the time of Jesus and how it works today? I talked last night about how the devil likes to lead us to think in a very inferior way about our own minds. How he does this with a large part of the populace. Because, you remember why we talked about that last night? It's not because he wants us to be humble. It's because he wants us to be dependent on someone else. The devil doesn't like humility, but he does like it when, by guiding one man, he can move 10. This trick is related. The devil tells people that people have been arguing about this topic for centuries. Great men have been talking about it. Have you heard anyone ever talk about an argument like this? I think one of the most famous ones, and I'm not even going to get into the details of it, but use it as an illustration, is the nature of Christ. When I was a child, I heard people talk about how there have been arguments in the church about this topic for 100 years. And the devil is trying to communicate something in that sentence, not so much about the nature of Christ, as about how I find truth. If the great, big, smart people can't agree, then there's no sense in me even studying the topic. That's a trick. As if God can't write things in such a way that we can understand them. Yeah, so part of the authorities disagree trick is just that. It's the idea that because even the elders in the church can't agree on this issue that's dividing the church, therefore it's kind of hopeless for me, the housewife, to get it. Do you understand? That's just an application of the very same trick. It really isn't true that the reason that people don't agree is because the data is so shady. Rarely is that it. James 4 says something different. It says that the wars and arguments among you come because people are serving their appetites, their passions, and their desires. That's the normal thing. I don't mean there isn't anything that's truly confusing, but you understand the trick. There's another part of this authorities disagree trick. You might call it the informed and intelligent judge trick. Almost I could have just been using it with you, this trick. People do use this with each other. For example, if I was, lecturing on whether or not it's a good idea to eat fish, if I talked like this, that some studies have been done that have shown that the fish has omega-3 oils that dramatically increase our ability to deal with depression and with stresses. But on the other hand, the studies in this part of Washington have shown that heavy metals from industry have begun really filling the fish and making them a real threat to our health. And then if I would say something like, but what the researchers have missed is, and then I share some other point. There is something I've said without using any words. I've said that I am a well-read person. I've read the studies on this side of the argument. I've read the studies on that side of the argument. I have evaluated them both. And since I've read them all thoroughly, I am the informed and intelligent judge. And you ought to believe what I have to say since I've already evaluated all the data. But that is just another version of the authorities disagree trick. Only in this trick, I'm making myself into the authority. And you fall for it terribly if you think that everyone who's read all the studies thinks the same as I do. As if my position is really based upon an objective consideration of all the data. I'm using too many big words to express a very simple thought. Let me just try to think of some other way to do it. The fact that someone else has studied something else, the fact that someone you know has studied a topic, doesn't really mean that you can trust them to be right on their conclusion. When I was teaching my very first year at Washita Hills Academy, teaching there, this was 1991, and some of you are old enough to remember what was going on in 1991. As if I'm an old man, that was so silly. And anyway, the one thing that was happening in 1991 was a lot of argument about tithe, about where tithe could or could not be spent or sent. And so here was my freshman Bible class at the academy, and their parents were really into this, and they weren't on the same side of the issue. Have you ever seen children whose parents were fighting? If they're 18, they often get along just great, but if they're 15, they often fight just like their parents do. I mean, it's just kind of interesting, this kind of thing. And so here were my students, and so I assigned them to write a research paper on the issue of tithe. I told them that I would not grade them on their conclusion. I would grade them only on the quality of their research. I wanted them to write at least 4 pages. Some of my students wrote 20 pages. They put more energy into this research project than into anything I'd given them before that in terms of study. When they handed in the papers, here was the disillusioning conclusion. I knew the positions that each of them had had before they had done any research. When they had finished their research, not one of my students had changed the position that they had before they did the research. Do you follow what I'm communicating? And someone who only knew one of my students could fall for the trick like this, that, wow, since John has put together 20 pages of information, he must be right. But do you see the trick in it? It's the intelligent, informed judge trick. You don't know if maybe the reason John came to that conclusion is because he had the conclusion before he even did his research. The only way you're going to know what's right is if you go after it yourself. And even after you do, you shouldn't expect anyone else to believe that you're right because you went after it yourself. Trick number 6 that we're talking about this morning is the "it doesn't affect me that way" trick. And I think maybe we can finish this one in 90 seconds. This is simply confusing sensitivity with vulnerability. I thought for a while this morning trying to find the right word for that, so I had to read my note. Sensitivity or vulnerability. Let me see if I can explain this so briefly. There are some people, my wife is one of these people, that if she eats something, she can feel kind of ill about it right away. It's not that way with me. And there are some people that when they eat a candy bar, they suddenly, within an hour or two, they feel sick. But you know, there are other people that can eat 5 candy bars and they just feel energized. Right? And there are people who can drink several beers and not even act like they have a buzz. And there are people that if they had half a can, you could just tell a difference in their mental frame of mind. This is the trick of the devil, to say that those that are less sensitive are less impacted. And it really isn't true. Sensitivity isn't an increased vulnerability, it's an increased ability to sense. To figure that something doesn't affect you just because you don't feel it just isn't sensible. That was like a pun. I don't know if you caught that or not. It was. Our trick number 7, I call it the "God told me" trick. I hope this doesn't make you nervous at potluck today or fellowship meal. But I don't tend to really credit people too much when they tell me that God told them such and such. Do you know what I'm talking about on this kind of thing? Here's what I find is that we have impulses and we have feelings and we have imaginations and even desires, and we often confound those things with the voice of God, especially when they relate to our desires. So that people will, we know when we first do this that it's wrong. We have an impression that some direction is the right way to go, and we tell someone, God told me to go such and such. But don't you know it's true that the first time we say it, we don't feel very good about saying it? I mean, the first time that we say that God told me, we sort of feel like we've misused His name. We have this premonition that was a real exaggeration. But the problem is that once we commit ourselves with speech, our minds are powerful at building up fake data to defend erroneous statements. I mean, we trick ourselves to find some way to get out of backtracking on what we said. What I'm communicating to you is be careful how you use the phrase, God told me. There are 3 ways that God communicates to us. You can find this in the 5th volume of the Testimonies, page 512. And in fact, I would recommend, for example, that you go to the website bibledoc.org and download a study called How to Know God's Will for Your Life. And that's all I'm going to say about that one. You ought to read it. We'll move on to point 8. I called this the I prayed and prayed trick. I prayed and prayed. I remember I had a student. Well, it was 2 students. This is in the early 90s. And they had inklings toward each other of the romantic type. And they prayed and prayed that God would help them know whether they were right for each other. And then, as they were driving together with a few others on a road, they saw within a few seconds of each other 2 road signs, like a Denny's restaurant type sign, those kind of signs. And the 2 signs had each of their names on them. One on one side and one on the other. And that was their, if you will, sign. I really didn't mean for this point to be funny, but I just realized it was, and I'm sorry. And I want to show you what's wrong with that way of thinking. Turn with me in your Bible to Psalm 32. Psalm 32, and we're looking at verse 8. Psalm 32 and verse 8. The passage says, I will instruct thee and teach thee in the way which thou shalt go. I will guide thee with mine eye. Be not as the horse or as the mule, which have no, what's the word? Understanding. Think that through for a minute. Whose mouth must be held in with bit and bridle. What God is saying is that there are 2 ways He expects to guide me. One is with His counsel. He expects to guide me with His counsel, and then He expects that that counsel is going to interact with another gift He already gave me, and that was my understanding. Because He didn't give understanding to the mule has to be guided by pain. But what did He give me so I don't have to be guided by pain? He gave me an understanding. My understanding, interacting with God's counsel, is His way of guiding me, and this is the prayed and prayed trick. It's that when God has given us the counsel that tells us which way to go, instead of reading it or believing it or going after finding what He said about direction, instead we pray for a miracle, or else we just choose a direction and pray that God will close the doors if it's not His will. That's the most common version of the trick. We pick a direction and pray that He'll close the doors. But God does not insult Himself by closing those doors as a way of bypassing His chosen means of communication to us. I mean, He gave us counsel. And if we don't go after the counsel, we shouldn't talk or act as if the open doors are the result of God's providence. We chose our own way. If you are going to choose a sign from heaven, you should choose something very, very strange. I mean, you shouldn't choose something like if the lights are not on in the sanctuary for a certain meeting. That's not strange enough. It should be more like if the light, one of them explodes and then turns into green jade or something. I'm telling you why you should pick a very silly something like that. Because when it doesn't happen, you'll realize that God didn't answer you by a sign. When you pick something too normal, you end up thinking you've been guided by a sign when all that really happened is you didn't go after His counsel. When you didn't go after His counsel and didn't use your judgment, you just ended up guiding yourself and then deluding yourself into thinking that you were being guided by Him. And yeah, it's a very nasty trick, the prayed and prayed trick. Our trick number 9 this morning, I don't have time to speak about it, so I'm just going to tell you what it is and tell you where you can get resources on it. It has to do with pain. Why did God let it happen is the idea. The trick is, I called it God let it happen trick. It's the idea that God can't be trusted, or I don't want to serve him or something because of some terrible thing in my experience. Maybe my parents got a divorce. That's how it often is for 12 or 13-year-olds. And really for older people too, but that's where it often starts. God let it happen. At that website, BibleDoc.org, I have 2 articles. One it's on why God allows things to happen. And I have another one on how to deal with pain, how to deal with the problems that have come your way. Those are both relevant. Has this scourge come to Northeast Washington where some young people are cutting themselves as a way of dealing with pain? Does that come up here? It's moved around. If it has, I really recommend that young people and parents read that second article on how to deal with pain. But for the questions of why did God allow it and how to deal with it, the devil has a bag of tricks that are well exposed in those resources. Also at the Ouachita Hills website, there are some archives of prayer meetings. And I did a prayer meeting on this just 2 weeks ago. They'll probably be there in a few weeks. You could watch it if you have high-speed internet. You could just see it. Why am I not talking about it here? Because just telling you where to find it took 3 minutes. And to talk about it would take another hour. It deserves more attention than that. The 10th one this morning, which isn't the last, I plan to go to get to 12. The 10th one is, I call it the slippery slopes trick. If you could picture it this way, many young people that grow up in a conservative environment especially, they know quite a few don'ts just from having been in the society for a while. And you probably know, because you live in this area, that not all the conservative families have the same don'ts. Does that make any sense to you when I'm communicating? There are various don'ts in the families. The devil will often tell a young person that if he is going to be conscientious, he's going to have to go all the way. In other words, if he's willing to give up this music, it won't be long until he will have given up every single thing that's important to him. And the devil tries to paint the path of conscientiousness as if it is something like penance. I don't know how to describe it as I know it's in the minds of so many young people, as if it's you can almost see a sign, if you want plight, read white. If you admit that it's wrong, freedom is gone. As if there are picketers who are saying, don't pass that threshold of conscientiousness. It's the slippery slope trick. The devil telling you that you're going to lose everything if you choose to be conscientious. Part of this trick is an extreme exaggeration of the fun derived from doing wrong. You might enjoy serving your lusts and going after your pleasures. You probably could enjoy it a little bit for a while. But it really isn't nearly as much fun as you pretend it is. It really isn't nearly as satisfying as the devil portrays it as being. Really, it isn't such a great thing that you're giving up. In fact, those who have given it up have said that they count those things as trash. Yeah, dung, the same idea, right? They count those things as worthless for what they gained. And what you're going after, you remember, is real treasures, things like love and peace and joy. These are substantial things, the benefits that you gain. to gain love and joy and peace over consecrating that thing that you know is wrong is a beautiful trait. And you can't really be sure that all of the don'ts you've heard about are legit until you've researched them for yourself. Really, the only thing for you to do is to trust that God loves you and knows best, and to one by one, to do the things He's asked for, and what you get is that love and joy and peace. Yeah, the slippery slope is an imaginary thing. Really, His ways are, what did we read earlier in Psalms? Pleasantness. There's pleasures forevermore there. There's a lot more about the slippery slope trick. It's in that article. I want to get to 3 more that are really important. Maybe 2 more. Number 11 is the duty to your family trick. Many young people and even middle-aged people, when they are struggling with some issue in their life, hold back on full consecration because of their desire to win their family. I've been talking to a young lady this year in California, who she was struggling with novels, for example. And then, just as she decided to stop reading them at Christmas time, 2 different relatives of her, trying to be very careful, purchased for her beautiful moral teaching pieces of fiction. And what did the devil tell her? That to not accept those, when she's surely going to see them, they're going to ask her how she enjoyed them, when they picked them out just to meet her needs, just to help. You understand the pressure the devil's putting on here. This is very much manipulation, what the devil does in this kind of situation. It's just low down manipulation, but that is what he always does, and you can't be surprised when he does it. But the pressure on her is that if she doesn't read those, it'll make her look like a real fanatic to these people who don't even understand her values at all. Do you understand what the devil is saying to her? And I just want to reply to her and to the general situation by telling you about Lot. Lot was in Sodom. And Lot hesitated to leave Sodom because he didn't want to lose his family. He was hesitant to move out in a hurry because he didn't want to lose his wife in particular. But what we learn in Patriarchs and Prophets is he did not understand at all how to help his family. When he hesitated, he communicated to them that he wasn't even as believing and sincere about his values as he was with his words. And if he had with great zeal left Sodom, his words would have hung around in the mind of his wife and would have trembled there and would have vibrated until she had realized that if he was willing to leave over this, he must really believe about this, and she would have got up and left also, and Lot's wife would not have died. I guess what I'm saying to the young and old here is that the best way you can serve your families is to be true to your convictions. When you are true to your convictions, even at the risk of offending or hurting, I don't mean you can be mean in how you do it. Not at all. We'll talk more about that later today. But when you're true to your convictions, only that communicates that you even really believe what you say you believe. And any other type of activity just undermines whatever you've tried to preach to them in the past. Ellen talks about this in one other way that's significant. She talks about people who have haunted homes. I believe in haunted homes, but not even do I think homes are haunted because some spirit likes to live there because of someone who died ages back. That is the superstitious haunted home. Would you like to know about the real haunted home? It goes like this. You are trying to do evangelism. You're giving Bible studies. The man you're studying with is just making a decision. He's on the verge of coming into the truth. And then the devil moves on some family member at a distance to call and tell you that they desperately need you to help them with some issue or problem in their life. And when that happens, if you leave the field of labor and the struggling person to go help your family, the devil is no dull scholar. He knows now what button to push to get you to do what needs to be done. And your family becomes a haunted home. I mean, whenever the devil wants to slow you down, he will irritate that vulnerable part of your experience. If you want to find this, you can do a search in the Ellen White CD-ROM on Let the Dead Bury Their Dead. It's around those statements that Ellen White talks about this haunted home concept. What she writes there is that if, on the other hand, you will stay true to your duty and help the struggling soul, the angels from heaven will be commissioned to help with your family and will do more there than you could have done with your own presence. And they will say to the devil, stand back. And you know, if you say it, it doesn't help a bit. But if they say it, it makes quite a difference. So there are another 16 tricks that we're not talking about at all in this series of lectures that I think you'd be worthwhile to look over them. And you can find those at BibleDoc.org. Let me summarize briefly and we'll close this morning's session. Everything I've said really can be summarized very simply, that we're going to have to go after the data ourselves. We're going to have to do the research ourselves. Nothing of our other methods of finding it is going to work. We can't find it by consensus. We can't find it by choosing a reliable authority. We can't get there by balancing between the two extremes. We can't get there by our impulses or imaginations or feelings. We can't get there by praying for a sign or by praying that God will give us permission to do such and such or we'll stop or block our way from getting there. We can't find God's will that way. We're going to have to go to the source. The devil will do anything to get us to bypass the only thing that will work. He gave us reasoning, not to reason without it, but to reason from it. That's what thinking is. If we're going to learn to think for ourselves, this is what it's all about. Learning to gather the data, to think through what it says, using the mind we've been given, and in that way, God will guide us to the path He wants us to follow. He says, don't be like the horse or the mule that must be kept in with bit and bridle. He would like to guide us with His counsel, by His eye, and in that way lead us to the very place He would like us to be. Let's bow our heads for a closing prayer. Our Father in heaven, I ask that you will bless the sessions we have later on today especially. That you would teach us what is right and best. And I ask that whatever I've shared this morning that is true, that you would impress that upon the minds of those that are here. That you would give power to your Holy Bible. And I ask for this gift in the name of Jesus. Amen.